Hey, welcome back to Salty. I bet you know someone who's salty. In fact, it's really, really easy for us, right, to think of someone who's salty. Yet oftentimes when we think of someone who's salty, we're thinking of it in the negative sense, aren't we? We're thinking of that person who's angry, that person who has just got a bit of rage going on, that person who's super defensive, who's just pushing back at us, really frustrated. That's often what we think of when we think of someone who's salty. And most of us, we don't want to be called salty because that's what we associate with it. Yet as we're going through the series Salty, our key verse, our foundational verse for this comes from Matthew 5, where Matthew says that, well, he's writing down what Jesus has said, and Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Here's what Jesus is telling us, that we want to be salty. You want to be salty. I want to be salty. In fact, when we get called salty, if it's in this positive sense, we should be stoked about it because that is what Jesus calls us as Jesus followers to be, is to be salty. Now, when I think about salt, I had a little lesson today from my brother-in-law who's an incredible chef, and he was just teaching me a little bit about what salt does to food. And he got some bread out there. He made some beautiful sourdough bread, and he put butter on 2 slices. And on one slice, he added some salt, and on the other, he didn't. And myself and a couple of others, we tried this bread, and we ate it with the butter, and it was really good. And then we ate it with the salt, and do you know what? It was even better. And what Josh told us is that what the salt does is it enhances the sweet flavors, and it sort of negates a bit of the sour flavors, so it makes it taste even nicer. And then he did it again with us, but this time he gave us some Russian fudge. And he gave us a piece of Russian fudge to try, and we ate this piece of Russian fudge, and then he added some salt onto it, kind of like the flavors we see a lot today of salted caramel. And we ate this, and I'll tell you what, the salt was even better because what it does is it really just draws out the flavors in the food. And when Jesus is calling us to be salty, that's the reason why, because he wants us to draw out the flavors to make the places where we go better. And that's what salt does. Salt makes things better. And so as we continue in this series called Salty, last week we looked at the salty Samaritan, and this week we're going to look at someone else who had a reason to be salty in the negative sense, but actually was salty in the positive sense. Let's see who we're talking about today. We're talking about Levi. And what in particular I want to look at is Levi's salty spheres, the salty spheres. This account can be found in Mark 2, and it's about Jesus calling Levi and what happens on the other side of Jesus calling him. Let's just work our way through this. It says, then Jesus went out to the lake shore again, and he taught the crowds that were coming to him. As he walked along, so as Jesus walked along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. And Jesus said, follow me and be my disciple. And I'd just like to pause here for a moment and say, hey, this is what Jesus calls you and calls me to, is just a call and says, follow me. He doesn't say you have to be perfect. He doesn't say you have to have your life all together. He simply says, follow me. And now that's really, really important. And it's in particular important for those of us that have maybe trying to figure out what Christianity is all about. Jesus just says, follow me. Because this was the pattern of the early disciples. Jesus would say to them, hey, come and follow me. And as these people started to follow Jesus, they then started to believe that Jesus was who he said he was. And then they started to behave the way that Jesus wanted them to behave. He just said follow, and then the beliefs got changed, and then the behavior came last. Unfortunately, many Christians in places can have the opposite approach and say you've got to behave right because that shows that you believe right, and then you'll be able to follow and belong. But Jesus' approach was different. He said, no, follow me. And as people follow, their beliefs start to change. And as their belief changes, the natural thing is their behavior starts to change. And I tell you what, here at Lifestyle, we want to be a place where we always got our arms wide open. Anyone can come. And we want to encourage you, no matter where you are, just to follow Jesus. Because if you follow him, and if you've never followed before, they can just start by picking up one of the books like Matthew and just reading through it and seeing what Jesus says and trying to do what he encourages us to do. But we're just going to follow him. We're going to observe. And as we watch Jesus, as we follow him, we're going to start to see that our beliefs change. And as our beliefs change, our behavior then comes. And where this is so powerful is when you and I, or when Christians often get pointed at and we get told that Christians, man, they're so judgmental. Christians think they're better than anyone else. Can I tell you what? That's the exact opposite of what a Christian should be. Because Christians, by their very nature, are the opposite of being better than everyone else. Because when we're a Christian, we say, no, I'm not good enough. That's why I need Christ. Why do I need Christ? Because my life, I fall short. I'm not good enough to do life on my own. I'm not good enough to meet God's standards. So I need Christ in my life to help me better, to help make me better, but also so His righteousness gets put onto me. So as Christians, we should never be standing up, looking down at people, telling them they're not good enough. No, we should be standing down low, looking up at Christ. So just a little side note there. And Jesus just says to Levi, He says, hey, follow me. And what happens next? Levi gets up and Levi follows Jesus. He just says later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. I love that. I love that Levi has just started following Jesus, and then he brings him to his house, and at his house there was tax collectors, and we'll talk about them in a moment and what that means. But also there was disreputable sinners, all these people that have got a bad reputation, all at this house. And I love what Mark adds. He says, there were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. There were many people with bad reputations that were among Jesus' followers. He says, but when the teachers of the religious law, who were the Pharisees, these are the elite religious people of the time, when they saw Jesus eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked Jesus' disciples. I find it interesting that these teachers of the law, the Pharisees, went and asked Jesus' disciples rather than going straight to Jesus, probably because the amount of times they'd asked Jesus questions directly and just got annihilated by Jesus' incredible answers. So they asked his disciples, why is Jesus eating with such scum? And what happens here is the religious elite, they label these people, these tax collectors and these sinners, they label them scum. They say, now these people are scum. Do you know that's what happens, team, when you and I become too religious? We start to look at other people and we start to label them scum. I don't ever want to get to a place where I look at someone and label them scum. No, I want to look at people the way that Jesus looked at them and see the gold that's inside of them. In fact, I once had it put to me this way, that when you look at a person, they've all got gold on the inside of them. What we sometimes have to do, though, is look a little bit harder to find it. Some people you look at and you can see the gold real easily. Other people you've got to sort of remove a bit of the mud in order to find the gold. What the religious elite do is they look at someone and they see the mud. What Jesus does, what He encourages us as His followers to do, if we're going to be salty in the positive sense, this is what we're going to do. We're going to look past the mud and we're going to see the gold, and we're going to call that gold out. And people, we're going to see the masterpiece that's in the mud, and we're going to tell people who they can be and what they can do and the places they can do and the places they can go because of the gold that's inside them, because of the fact that God is alive on the inside of them, because He created them as a masterpiece. So if we never get to find ourselves falling into that place where we're pointing at Him or pointing at her, labeling them scum, man, we have to take a long, hard look in the mirror, because we've probably moved into that very religious place rather than trying to be like Jesus, who lives with compassion and looks at people and cares for them and values them. And then when Jesus heard these questions being asked of His disciples, He told them, He says, healthy people don't need a doctor. No, healthy people don't. It's the sick people who do. And I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. So again, all of us who call ourselves Christians, that's why we are down low looking up at Jesus, not above people pointing down at Him, because we know that we're sinners. We know that we're not good enough and we need Jesus. So there's our account of Levi, who was someone who really started off being salty with people and then became salty, having a powerful influence. And what I want to do is just look at three spheres of people for whom he was extremely salty, in the proper sense, with. And the first sphere was the tax collectors, because Levi had influence with these tax collectors because he was a tax collector. Let me tell you a little bit about what this means and what it means to be a tax collector. It's because at this time, the Jewish population was enclosed within the wider Roman Empire. The Jewish people had to pay taxes to the Roman Empire. And no one really likes paying taxes. And in particular, in this case, there was even less liked it because when the people in the region where they'd pay taxes to the Roman Empire, that money would essentially go to Rome. A small proportion of it would be spent back in their area, but most of it was spent in Rome looking after the Romans rather than on them. So they're paying all this tax, of which a very small percentage is coming back to actually help them. Most of it is blessing the Romans in a whole nother city. So the Jewish people, they didn't want to be paying this tax. They despised paying this tax. But what the Romans did to gain control or to get this tax is they'd find someone in that local area, and that person would be the tax collector who was then responsible for getting the tax off their own people and sending it to Rome. So this person was really considered a traitor because they were turning on their own people in order to take their money and tax it and send it back to Rome. And this person had a lot of influence, had a lot of power, because when they came asking for tax, if people didn't want to pay any tax, all this person had to do was call upon the might of the Roman army who would come in behind them and enforce the tax to be paid. And people despised tax collectors even more because this was how tax collectors made their money. A tax collector was given an amount. You have to generate, or you have to pay $50 million worth of tax from that region. That's what's got to come to the Roman Empire. That tax collector could then go into that region, tax people as much as they wanted, do it however they liked, just to ensure that $50 million got paid to the Roman Empire. But the tax collector made his money by overtaxing and keeping the rest. So if that tax collector collected $70 million worth of revenue, he'd send $50 million up there and he'd keep $20 million for himself. If he raised $55 million, again, he'd send the 50 to keep Rome happy, but he'd pocket the rest. And so these people were really despised. They were really hated on because they'd overtax in order to fund their own lifestyle. And they were living quite a lavish lifestyle. They threw big parties. They did a lot of big things because no one really liked them because everyone was already salty at them for being a tax collector. And they were really seen as being the lowest rung of society. And what we see here is Levi's got this reputation, or he's got not this reputation, he's got this influence that he's built with other tax collectors. And what I love about Levi is he's sitting at his tax collector's booth, he's raising his money, and Jesus says, "Come follow me." And what we're told is later, so soon after, Levi says, "Look, I've had this powerful encounter with Jesus." And remember, he's someone who's been cast aside, who's been pushed aside by the religious elite of the day. They wouldn't even talk to him. They don't even like him. Remember, they saw Jesus eating with them. They said, "Why is Jesus eating with scum like this?" So he's been pushed aside by the religious people of the day, and he's got this strong connection with other tax collectors because, again, these are all the people that have been pushed to the side of society. So they sort of hang out together because everyone else is salty at them in a negative way, which probably causes them to be salty back in a negative way and just getting more and more tension over time. But even though he's been pushed aside by the religious elite, when he encounters Jesus, I think that Levi heard something in the way that Jesus said, "Hey, come follow me." He experienced the compassion that he'd never felt before. He had experienced someone caring for him like he'd never experienced before. He felt valued like he'd never felt valued before. He felt loved like he'd never felt loved before. He felt important maybe like he'd never felt important before. And he says, "Okay, I'm going to follow you." And as he's getting to know Jesus, he realized, man, Jesus is the Son of God. And he gets to the place where he's like, I want to help people in my sphere, the other tax collectors, come to meet this man who I've got to know. And so how does Levi leverage this influence that he's got with tax collectors? He decides to throw a party. Who doesn't like parties? You love parties. I love parties. There's something cool about parties. And so what Levi does is he says, man, I'm going to get Jesus and his disciples to come to this dinner party, but I'm also going to invite all my tax collector friends and all those other outcasts that are known as really bad sinners. I'm going to bring them all into a room and I'm just going to see what happens. Because I think if they get to meet the Jesus that I know, if they get to experience his warmth, his love, his acceptance, his care, the way that he values people, maybe, just maybe, they'll experience what I've experienced. And so Levi throws this incredible party and he leverages the influence that he's got with these tax collectors to help them come to know the Jesus that he knows. And see, this is what's true for you and what's true for me. We all have spheres of influence. We have spheres of influence maybe in our workplace, within our family, within a sports team we might be a part of, with maybe parents of other kids that we're engaging with. It might be we go to the same restaurant or cafe every day for coffee or lunch, and we're similar crowd. We've got another sphere of influence there. We've got a sphere of influence because of the neighborhood that we live in. So we've got our neighbors, and all of us have got a whole lot of spheres of influence. What I want to encourage you to do is to identify what spheres of influence you've got, because you'll have at least probably 3, 4, 5, maybe more spheres of influence, places where you've got influence. And I want to encourage you to be like Levi and say, how do I utilize the influence that I've got in these spheres so people can experience and people can come to know the Jesus that I know? Because that's what we see Levi do. He says, man, I've got this influence with these tax collectors. How can I create an environment in a place where Jesus and his disciples can come in and mix and mingle, and we'll just see what the result is? I'll tell you what, something powerful, powerful happens when you and I can create environments where we're bringing places we've got our sphere of influence, we can bring Jesus into the mix. What's so exciting about this is, as we see later on, that there's another tax collector called Zacchaeus who comes to faith. And I can't help but wonder, and we're not told this, but I can't help but wonder whether if Zacchaeus was one of the people that were around that dinner table that night that had an encounter with Jesus all for himself, because Levi threw this party and enabled his sphere of influence to bump into the Jesus that he knew. That was one sphere of influence that Levi's got. What if we continue? A second sphere of influence that Levi's got is the Jewish population. You see, Levi was a Jew. He was a Jewish man. And so what he did was he leveraged his background in order to enable him to actually reach a whole group of Jewish people. And what's amazing about this is it was Jewish people that were really salty with Levi because he was a tax collector, and he was most likely salty in the negative sense too. And yet we find that he becomes salty in the positive sense. We talked about it last week, but often it's the people that we're salty with in the negative sense that God calls us to be salty with in the positive sense. But let me just explain something to you really, really quickly. This is really cool. This is about the Gospels. And what the Gospels are in the Scriptures is there's 4 accounts of Jesus' life. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these 4 versions of these 4 accounts of Jesus' life are all included in the New Testament and in the Bible. And there's 4 accounts of Jesus' life, and they all differ a little bit. And this is why. If I were to find 4 people to write an account in my life, there's going to be a lot that's the same, and there's going to be a lot of differences because people have got a different perspective of my life. They all might write about the same event, they come at it from a different angle. Some will highlight some events, others will highlight others because of the relationship. For instance, if I asked my wife to write an account of my life, she'd write about certain things and she'd bring out certain parts about my character and my traits. I might ask my mum to write an account of my life, and she'd again highlight a whole lot of things. Some of those would overlap with Mindy, some would be different. I might ask a friend of mine to write an account of my life, and then he would write out a whole lot of stuff. And then I might ask one of my kids to write an account of my life. So you see how these 4 different people that were an account of my life, they'll talk about some of it will be the same, some of it will be different, some will be the same event but from a different perspective. That's exactly what the Gospels are. And this is one of the reasons why we know that the Gospels are true, because they don't match up word for word all the way through. If someone was going to make this stuff up, they'd just probably copy the same thing over and over and over to make sure that it synced up and lined up absolutely perfectly. But because we've got 4 accounts from 4 different people, each coming from a different perspective, yet really telling the same overall story, it gives us a greater level of trust in the authenticity of the Gospels. And so the Gospels that are written about Jesus' life, let's just work backwards. One was written by John, and a bit of a high-level overview is when John wrote his Gospel, he was really targeting it at Christians, people that knew Jesus, and the emphasis of his book is on the principle of Jesus' teaching. Now, some of you might have read the Gospels over and over and over. You'll see these patterns and you'll see these to be true. Others, I just encourage you just to keep reading them over and over, and you'll see this starts to play out when you read them. Luke, he wrote his Gospel more for a Greek audience, and his emphasis was Jesus' humanity, and that was often because he's a doctor, so he just really understands humanity and the human body, and talked a lot about the emphasis being on Jesus' humanity. The next one's written by Mark. Now, Mark, his audience was the Roman people, and his emphasis was on Jesus' miracles and Jesus' actions. That's sort of what he highlighted. And then the fourth one was written by a man called Matthew. Matthew's audience was the Jewish people, and his emphasis was on what Jesus sort of taught in his sermons and the way that Jesus linked back to the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was essentially the Jewish scriptures. And what Matthew does, which neither Mark, Luke, or John do, to the same level of degree, is he quotes Old Testament. He quotes the Psalms and says, hey, look, this points to Jesus. He looks at what some of the prophets say, look, this is pointing directly to Jesus. And he's writing this letter really about Jesus' life, primarily for a Jewish audience. And that's why he puts in all these Old Testament references, because the Jews understand that, and he's helping them see what he saw, that all of those scriptures, all of those prophets are pointing to Jesus. The psalmist is pointing to Jesus, because Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. What I want you to understand, this is so powerful. This is so cool. Who is Matthew? Matthew is Levi. That's what makes this so special, because Matthew was Levi. He had two names. You might ask, why would Matthew have the name Levi and Matthew? We don't actually know. There's some really good theories. Some people say that he probably had two names because, like Simon, who met Jesus, and Jesus said, I'm going to change your name from Simon to Peter. He had the name Simon and he had the name Peter. Maybe Jesus met Levi and said, I'm going to call you Matthew, so you've got two names. Other people think, oh, it might be because Levi came from the Jewish tribe of Levi. So he had the name Levi, but his other name was Matthew. Other people might say that, well, Levi's name was Levi, but because he crossed over to start really working with the Roman Empire as a tax collector, he wanted to adopt a name that was more culturally relevant, so he adopted the name Matthew. But no matter why he ended up with Levi and Matthew, what you need to understand is Matthew, who wrote this gospel, is Levi, who was sitting at his tax collector's booth, and Jesus said, come and follow me. And this is so powerful, because the very people that Levi was salty with and was rubbing up against and were not getting on very well, all of a sudden he became salty with in a powerful, positive way, so much so that he wrote a letter so that they'd all understand who Jesus was. And again, we asked this last week, but it's just too important to leave out. What does it take to shift our saltiness? What does it take to shift our saltiness from being in the negative sense to being salty in the positive sense? And it really is this, right? It really is the cross. It's that moment with Jesus. It's that time where we really get to know how loved and how valued we are, that God cares for you and that he loves you and he loves me so much that he's willing to die for me. And when I've got that perspective on life, it can help me shift from being salty in the negative sense to salty in the positive sense. And this is so important. Listen to me close here. Some of us are in a place where there's a lot of salty people towards us in the negative sense, where people are just salty to us, and it's starting to get on our nerves, and it's starting to cause us a lot of frustration, it's starting to cause us a lot of angst. And what I want you to understand is that sometimes it's the people that you want to be salty with in the negative sense, that God's calling you to be salty with in the positive sense. That there might be a lot of saltiness going on in your workplace, and people might be looking down on you and frowning upon you because of your faith. That actually those are the very people that you're called to be salty to in the positive sense. And it's so vital that we get this, because someone watching this, you might be about to walk out of your job because, man, there's just so many people that are salty towards you. But can I understand that maybe, just maybe, God is calling you to be salty in that environment? Don't walk away. Don't walk away. See, maybe you're there and everyone else, maybe at the end of week work drinks is going out and getting trolleyed, and you're different because you're there sipping on your your Diet Coke or your soda water, whatever it might be. And you know, everyone's just mocking you and teasing you. Why don't you do this? Why don't you? No, because I'm trying to embrace and live the life that Jesus wants me to live. And then they're causing you and they're persecuting you and they're laughing at you. But I want to encourage you to remain in that place. Continue to be salty, not salty. Maybe other people in your workplace are happy to lie in order to make more sales or to get more clients and to bury the truth a little bit, to appear better than things are. And you're like, no, I'm going to do this with integrity. And people are starting to tease you. They're saying, no, don't bring him out on sales calls. Don't let him near my clients because he's going to blow up because he's got too much integrity. I want to encourage you to be salty, because sometimes the very people that we want to be salty to are the people that God's calling us to be salty to. I hope that makes sense. Right, let's look at the third sphere. The third sphere that we see Levi engage with is the outcasts. You see, Levi understood what it was like to be an outcast. As a tax collector, he was consistently pushed to the outside of culture. He was consistently pushed to the outside of society. He didn't have a huge social group because, man, they were just cast aside. Yet Levi had a real heart for the outcast. He was an outsider and he knew what it was like to be an outsider. And so, there's so many examples you can find us, but I think the best example we can find is written right at the top of the letter that Levi or that Matthew wrote, explaining who Jesus was. If we go to Matthew 1:1, it starts off like this. It says, "This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham." See what Levi's doing right here, or Matthew, whatever you want to call him. What he's doing right here is, again, he's just telling us again that this is written for a Jewish audience. That's why he's saying that Jesus is the Messiah that the Jews have been waiting for, that they knew was going to come from the line of David and from the line of Abraham. So he's just really emphasizing right at the start that for Jewish people in particular, this is really, really important. And what I'm about to show you, many of you might have read over and over and over again as you've read through the account of Matthew, but maybe you haven't seen this because this is fascinating what Levi does. And then he lists out this genealogy. And again, that's why a lot of us don't see it, because we sort of scan through the genealogy. And the way the genealogy tends to work is you say Abraham was the father of Isaac. And then you say Isaac was the father of Jacob. And you're meant to just go linear all the way through father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son, just to show the genealogy. And then that's all it's meant to cover. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. But what's interesting is what Levi does. He then says, Jacob was the father of Judah, and that's where a full stop should be, and then it should say, and Judah was the father of, and keep going. But what Levi does is incredible. He actually adds a few words. What he does is he adds a little bit of commentary to what's going on, and he just adds these 3 words, and his brothers. We might not think much of this. Well, cool, that's cool, he's got brothers, that's awesome. But do you know what Levi's doing? Levi's doing something so profound and so special, and we'll see a pattern of this. What Levi's doing is he's reminding his readers of the outcasts. He's reminding his readers of some of the darker characters or the darker times of Jewish history. See, when he talked about Abraham, he never mentioned who Abraham's wife was, Sarah, who's very well known. But when he gets to Judah, he actually recognizes his brothers. Why does Levi talk about Judah's brothers? Because Judah and his brothers, they tried to kill Joseph. In fact, they schemed to and they planned to kill one of their brothers, kill Joseph. But then instead of killing him, they say, no, let's not kill him, let's sell him to slave traders, because at least we'll get some money for that, and we'll get a better return than if we just kill him and leave him for dead, and he will essentially be dead if he's taken away as a slave. So they sell their brother off into slavery. And what Levi does is he captures this whole story in his account. Something that should be forgotten, he brings out to the forefront. But he keeps going. He then says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah. And again, we see a little bit of commentary. And he says, whose mother was Tamar. Do you know about Tamar? I'm not going to talk about this right now, but if you want to go and do a little bit of research on your own, go to Genesis 38 and you'll get this whole story. Again, it's very messy, very yuck. not something you want to have highlighted, something that normally you want to keep hidden away, not brought out into the spotlight. And what Levi does is he brings it out into the spotlight. If you do go and read it, make sure you don't use this as a passage to read to your kids as you're putting them to bed. Not appropriate, cause a whole lot of questions you don't want to answer. Maybe read it on your own, Genesis 38. Then it says, Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. So it's again, he's just writing through this as you'd expect. Father, son, father, son. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. And again, we get a little bit of commentary from Levi, whose mother was Rahab. Who's Rahab? She was a prostitute. And he includes her in this little lineage. He's really trying to identify the parts of the Jewish history that aren't so perfect, that aren't so clean. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Why does he talk about Ruth? Because Ruth wasn't even Jewish. She was a Moab. She was from a different nation. So he highlights that again. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon. And again, we see a little bit more commentary coming from Levi, this time talking about Solomon. He said, hey, who was Solomon's mother? Oh, she was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Again, why does he do this? Because David had an affair with one of his top lieutenant's wives and then killed Uriah in order to hide her up. What Levi's doing here is he's bringing out the dark parts of the past and putting it front and center. Why? Because Levi had a heart for the outcast. And he wanted everyone to know that no matter how perfect you think you might be, no matter how perfect you think your lineage is, there's always skeletons in the closet. He was looking out for the outcast. And he was saying, look, if we look back through Jewish history, if we look back through this incredible family tree, man, there's some incredible people and incredible heroes, but there's also some very dark, very difficult, very hard to understand times. And what he wants to do is make everyone see that God isn't just the God for those who are perfect. No, God is the God of those who have been, or who consider themselves to be outcasts, those who have been pushed aside by society, those who society would rather cover up and keep hidden. No, Levi says, now let's get those sort of people out into the light, because remember, Jesus came not for the healthy, but for the sick. Now, what that means for you and what that means for me is this. It means some of us have got a bit of a backstory, and maybe we've been trying to cover it up. Can I tell you that no matter what your backstory is, that Jesus will meet you right where you are. You don't have to cover it up. In fact, you might feel like you're an outcast when it comes to faith, when it comes to Christianity. Maybe you're later in life and you're thinking, man, I've spent all my life knowing nothing about God. Why would I start to think about it now? Because ever since you were born, God's been thinking about you. Some of you might think, man, I've done this and I've done that. I need to keep it. God's saying, no. You can't change your past. You can't change what you've done. But I want to tell you that if you choose to move forward in a brand new way, you can create a whole new future for yourself. And I'm so thankful that I know a God, and you can know a God that doesn't write us off because of our backstory, yet he uses it to make his grace even more beautiful. He uses it to make his love even more meaningful. That's a God that I want to get to know. That's a God that you can get to know. How cool is that? Hey, as we just maybe take a moment to sit back and reflect. Why don't we listen to the song, enjoy it, and then I'll come back and pray for you.
Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Awake, arise, inhale the light, and come alive, come alive. I'm gonna sing to you, dry bones, until you're covered in light, and the valleys bloom like a rosebud in the light. Hear the call to attention ground is dry, but the clouds are overhead. Oh, I'ma sing it again. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Awake, arise, inhale the light. Come alive, come alive. Are you waiting on heaven? Or is it waiting on you? For the Holy Ghost, He's already in the room. Hey! Well, so you better get ready. 'Cause who knows what He'll do? And when the four winds blow, there's a breakthrough breaking through. So I'ma prophesy again. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Awake, arise, inhale the light. And come alive, come alive, come alive. Get up and rise, arise. So leave those shackles in the grave now and dance like you were young. Oh, you do not have to live in chains now. There's a key within your song. So leave the past where it belongs, child, and take a leap into the light. Come find the freedom you were born for. I'ma tell that soul to rise, arise, arise, arise. Get up now, rise, arise. And I will sing it again. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Come alive, come alive, come alive, dry bones. Awake, arise, inhale the light. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, you come alive. Get up and rise. Oh, get up now, rise. Oh, get up now and rise. And up from these ashes, let new life be born. And up from these ashes, we'll see flesh on the bone.
All right, let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for Levi. I thank you that, man, even though he was an outcast, you reached out to him and you said, follow me. I thank you that, man, he models for us so well the fact that we all have spheres of influence that we can make a difference in. And Father, I pray you help all of us identify those spheres and go out and make a difference in them. Father, I pray in particular for those of us that feel like we're outcasts, that feel like we're not good enough, that feel like, man, we have been pushed to the side, that you'll let us know in a way that only you can, and that we are loved by you, that you care about us, that you are there with us through everything, and you can help us move forward in a whole new way if we're simply willing to follow you. So, Father, I pray you'll help all of us to go out there and to be salty in that positive sense. I thank you that Levi was someone who started off so salty, yet ended up so salty. And I pray that you can help us to be salty as we go through this week. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen, amen, amen. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. You have a great week ahead.